evening, everyone. Here is Geraldo Lemos Neto, and I'm here with Marco Gandra, live from Belo Horizonte, Brazil. We are broadcasting the program to Know Spiritism. Today is the program number 19. We are live for Discover Spiritism Network, DSN, also Spiritism Dissemination, and also Kardec Radio. Today we are going to talk about the character of the Spiritist doctrine. Please, Gandra, the character of the Spiritist revelation is the first chapter of the book, the last book of Allan Kardec that he published in January the 6th, 1868 in Paris, The Genesis, Miracles, and Predictions According to Spiritism. The next, as we can see here, this is the front page for the first edition in Paris in French, and nowadays we have the one in English, Genesis, Miracles, and Predictions According to Spiritism. We have to note some important things here. First, we can see that this is the front page of the edition of 1868, the first edition in Paris, 6 January 1868 by Allan Kardec. And another example of the cover page, the name in English, and here we have this note from one of Allan Kardec's writers that wrote about Allan Kardec's life. He was Henri Sauce from France, and we can see by researchers on the Genesis book that he wrote around 1884 and 1885. He wrote that after the 5th edition of 1872, the original book, the Genesis, the Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism, they were altered by Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie. As a matter of fact, after the 5th edition of 1872, there is a statement that the edition is revised, corrected, and augmented by Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie. Nowadays, we can compare the original book that was revised by Allan Kardec himself. And because by the French law, the author of one book must give the library in Paris one original copy of his book and sign this copy. And because of that, the National Library in Paris have the only ones that are signed by Allan Kardec are the first, the second, the third, and the fourth edition. So that the original thought, the original work by Allan Kardec is only until the fourth edition of 1868, 1869, before his death in March 31st, 1869. So the only original works by Allan Kardec are the ones until the fourth edition. And this is very important information, because if we are studying the Spiritist Spiritism doctrine. We must know this, and we must be very careful not to extrapolate uh, the thinking of Allan Kardec, and especially not accept this revised, correct, and augmented edition by Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie. And we must now focus in the fourth edition. That was the latest edition that Allan Kardec himself published. And that's why we are focusing on this. Why this is so important? First, we can see by the studies of Mr. Simone Privato Goidanich, a Brazilian researcher, spiritist researcher, that used to live in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and she traveled to Paris, and she was able to go in the archives of the National Library in Paris, and she got to see the latest edition of Allan Kardec himself, the fourth edition of this book, the Genesis. And she compared this fourth edition, the original French fourth edition of the book, the Genesis, Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism, with the one that was published in Brazil. And she started to compare those editions, and she found out many problematic things, alterations, extrapolations, and so that she wrote this book, very important book, El Legado de Allan Kardec, that was first published in Spanish in Argentina. Nowadays we have this book in Portuguese in Brazil, O Legado de Allan Kardec. And also, because of her researches, and also because of the new findings of the FIAL, which is nowadays the Fundação Espírita André Luiz of the Guarulhos city, that is the maintainer of the group Boa Nova there, the TV Mundo Maior, and the radio Boa Nova, and the works of Dr. Henrique, I just forgot the name, but the one, Dr. Figueiredo, that is researching all the writings, all the material that was brought to Brazil by Dr. Canuto de Abreu in São Paulo, the original writings, letters, and documents from Allan Kardec himself that Canuto de Abreu brought to Brazil in the 30s and 40s, before the Second World War, and right before the Nazi invasion in Paris. And all this material was decades in boxes and not accessible to the public. And after a long journey, all those materials went to the FIAL, the Fundação Espírita André Luiz in Guarulhos, and they are now studying it, translating it to Portuguese. They are now, Dr. Paulo Henrique Figueiredo, they are now also copying it, and also transmitting it to the public through books and also through a website. And in conjunction with Mr. Simone Privato Goidanich, they concluded that the fifth edition of this book, that was the one that received corrections or augmentations by Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie. Sorry. They altered more than 400 texts, original texts from Allan Kardec that were altered, not only in the process of writing, but also in the meaning. And some of these alterations were very harmful to the original thought, the original thinking by our beloved Allan Kardec, so that we do not recommend any of us Spiritists to study and to base our studies in those editions after Allan Kardec, in those fifth editions on. And because of that, we must focus our study until the fourth edition. Also, we can see the problems that the survivals of Allan Kardec at that time, after the death of Allan Kardec in 1869 in Paris, all the problems that were faced by the Paris Spiritist Association that was founded by Kardec, the problems that were faced by Gabrielle Delany and the widow of Allan Kardec, Madame Amélie Boudet, the problems that Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie and Mr. Roustang caused to the Spiritist doctrine and to the Spiritist movement after the death of Allan Kardec. And those problems can be known and studied and seen by these two books of our friend from the city of Santo André, São Caetano, São Paulo, Mr. Adriano Calzoni, that wrote two new researchers on Spiritism in France after Kardec's death. The first one is Em Nome de Kardec, in the name of Kardec. Unfortunately, this book is only available in Portuguese nowadays. And the second book is Madame Kardec, the history that time almost erased, that the problems that were faced by Allan Kardec's widow, Madame Amélie Boudet. And those two books in complementation, in conjunction with the one that were written by Mr. Simone Privato Goidanich, are very helpful for us to understand the problems that were faced by the ones that survived Allan Kardec's death in the late 19th century, especially in the years of 1870, 1880, and 1890, before the 20th century. We can see now. Now we are going to analyze the book, the Genesis, the Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism. Formally, we can say that Allan Kardec originally placed this book in three different parts. The first one is the one that is dedicated to the Genesis. The second one is the one that is dedicated to the miracles. And the third one is the one that is dedicated to the predictions, the mediumship to foresee the future. But as a matter of fact, we can divide this book in four different parts. And the first one would be the character of the Spiritist revelation. That was a small document that Allan Kardec himself published before the Genesis as a pamphlet, and afterwards he decided to include this text that is called Character of the Spiritist Revelation as the first and most important chapter of his last book, The Genesis, the Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism. So that we are going to study today this very first chapter and very first part of the later book from Allan Kardec. Please, Gandra. And we can reason that by the time of the appearance of this book in the year 1868, when the book was published, Allan Kardec was already experienced man and mature on all matters relating to mediumship and Spiritism doctrine. He was a more mature man, more experienced man, even according to the revelations, the Spiritist revelations. He was more aware of his pathway, and because of that, this book is very important, because we can see here, especially in this first chapter, the character of the Spiritism revelation, that his thinking are more profound and more related to the future. As we know, this book was published a little more than 1 year before his own death. So, Allan Kardec also, in this text, the character of the Spiritist revelation, asks, what is the source of credible information for Spiritism? As we can see in the item 3, he states, the essential characteristic of any revelation has to be truth. This is very important. The essential characteristic of any revelation has to be truth. But what is truth? By its nature, writes Kardec, Spiritist revelation has a double character. It participates at the same time of divine revelation and scientific revelation. So he is revealing us that Spiritism is a revelation that has two faces, has a double character. The first one and most important one is the revelation by divine inspiration, the one that came through the higher spirits in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that by himself is speaking to us in the name of God. So it's something that comes from the higher plans to our understanding. But Spiritism does not stop there. The other part is the scientific revelation that complements, that uh, does to the humans here incarnated or discarnated in the spiritual plans. They it opens the door to everyone to contribute to this revelation through scientific meanings, through study and scientific meanings. So, because of that, we can understand that science also is part of the Spiritist revelation. And this is the part that mean incarnated or discarnated is asked to contribute to. So Kardec states, it participates in the second because this teaching is not the privilege of any individual, but imparted to all in the same way. Because they are not those who transmit it and those who receive it, passive beings, exempt from the work of observation and research. For not giving up reasoning and free will, because they are not barred from examination, but on the contrary, recommended. In short, because the doctrine was not dictated complete, nor imposed to blind belief. This text is very, very much important. So very much important. Because as we can see the thought here that Allan Kardec himself was transmitting to us is that men here would be we would have a very important role in the discovery of the scientific meanings, the scientific works that, after all, is discovering the laws from God, the laws from the universe, the function from the universe. And because of that, we can understand why Allan Kardec is telling us that the Spiritist doctrine was not given complete in the 19th century to the humankind. And also, it was not imposed by blind belief. It was not a fanatic imposition to people. This is very, very much important because we can understand why the Spiritist doctrine is a doctrine that will evolve in the pathway in conjunction with the scientific revelation, century after century, millennia after millennia. We will have the development, the improvement of the Spiritist doctrine through the works of men here, through the works of the scientists themselves, because they are also revealing to us the nature laws, the laws that God himself wrote that regulates everything, everywhere, so that we will always be in a development mode. The Spiritist doctrine that was revealed to Allan Kardec in the 19th century was the first step and not the last step, was the introduction. It was the part of the divine revelation through the higher spirits that inspired him the fundamental laws of the spiritual life, the incarnation, the mediumship, all kinds of interpolations of the influence of the spirits in the material world and the relation between all the plans, the spiritual life plans and other planets with the life here on earth. And here are the double character of the Spiritist doctrine. It has the first and most important one, the character of the divine revelation that was given to us by the higher spirits in name of Jesus, in name of God. But in the other hand, there is one that is up to us, and that is the works of the men and women that are studying and discovering all the laws of physics, astrophysics, medicine, biology, chemistry, everything related to science. And the second character of the Spiritist revelation is the scientific revelation that must be done, must be completed by ourselves, by the human beings, so that they are able to understand their world, our world, and relate all the information that science gives us to the first information that the divine revelation gave us. We will continue next week with this topic because our time is running out, but this is a very important thing that we can study. I hope you'll be with us. So you have a good night and see you next week. Thank you so much.